Good morning, Humber Valley. Good morning, YouTube. My name is Trevor Brisbin, and thank you for making space for this. So we've got a lot to do today, so let's just get straight to it. The last 4 weeks, we've been immersed in the book of Lamentations. It's a collection, if you remember, of 5 poems reflecting the tragic, traumatic, heart-wrenching life of an ancient Jewish tribe called Judah. Judah and its capital city, Jerusalem, was conquered by another tribe of people called Babylon. And it's bad. Like, Babylon is ruthless to them. You can say it's a Holocaust. Our first week in Lamentations, we talked about how the book invites us into the space where we can actually express our pain and disappointment with life. Like, there's no denying pain in this book. We talked about how church can become like a crack house if you're not careful, where we want the church to make us feel better. But our job is not to avoid pain in a community. It's to be honest about it and have the faith to work through it. Then the next week we talked about being a people who see the pain and exile of others. To lament isn't to wallow in self-pity, but to actively engage to make right the systems and structures that dehumanize people and devalue creation. And if you remember, we talked specifically about anti-Asian racism in that second week. It might be worth circling back just in case you missed it. Then week number 3, we talked about the woman's instinct to blame God for everything that's gone wrong, the woman's voice in Lamentations. And we talked about this idea that maybe God isn't the cause of human suffering, because God is always at least as nice as Jesus. And then last week, we talked about how Lamentations 3 is this tug of war between a crappy first draft perspective of life and a mustard seed step of faith, grasping for hope. This week, we come to chapter 5, the last chapter. We wrap up our series this week, and spoiler alert, there's no happy ending in this one. Much of chapter 5 will sound tragically familiar. Let's pick it up in verse 8. They write, this is the narrator's voice, "Slaves rule over us, and there is no one to free us from their hands. We get our bread at the risk of our lives because of the sword in the desert. Our skin is as hot as an oven, feverish from hunger. Women have been violated in Zion and virgins in the town of Judah. Princes have been hung up by their hands. Elders are shown no respect. Young men toil at the millstones. Boys stagger under the loads of wood. The elders are gone from the city gates. The young men have stopped their music. Joy," verse 15, "joy is gone from our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning." It's often been said that time heals all wounds. Well, as we come to the end of Lamentations, we're quickly running out of time, and these wounds are still very much gaping. In fact, as you read right to the end, there's this stubborn refusal of resolution in the book. Listen to verse 19 and 20. "You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long?" Now, do you remember, we've talked about this a couple times, do you remember what Lamentations means in Hebrew? Lamentations is the Greek word. What does it mean in Hebrew? Do you remember? It literally means the book of how. The book of how. It starts by asking the question of how, but 5 chapters later leaves us asking why. Why do you forget us, God? Why do you let this stuff happen to us? And then the last 2 verses. "Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. There it is again, right? That crappy first draft. There is no resolution to Lamentations. There is no happy ending. And that's hard, right? Because the books and the stories and the films we tend to gravitate to usually tie everything up in a nice happily ever after. This one just leaves us with a haunting why. It's almost like the unresolved pain of these poetic voices, the narrator, the man, and the woman, this community, this chorus, holds space for the unresolved pain in our lives and in our communities. Is there a relationship you have or maybe had and you're carrying around some unresolved stuff? Like, would you love to ask someone, like, why did you say that? Or why didn't you say something? Why did you let that happen? Or why didn't you even make an effort? Where are you carrying unresolved whys? Is it a business relationship that turned into a train wreck? Is it a parent who died before you got to say what you needed to say or hear what you needed to hear? If you know what it feels like to carry that which is unresolved, you know it's heavy, right? Like it can weigh you down. And I think in its poetic structure, Lamentations reminds us that maybe time won't heal all wounds. And maybe the narrator and the woman and the man are trying to create the space for us to ask questions about where our story is going. There may be some unresolved whys, but with some intentionality, a little bit of faith, maybe some time with a good therapist, perhaps there doesn't have to be as much left unresolved as we think. So, the book of Lamentations ends by asking the big why questions of God. Five chapters of pain and unimaginable human suffering. God, why? You ever ask that question? God, why is this happening to me? I think the God why or the why God question is a fair question. I think it's a good question. I think it's a very human and appropriate question for us to ask of God. I'm okay with the why question. Like a child is abused. 8 women in Atlanta gunned down. Slavery, Holocaust, cancer, COVID. Why? God, why did you let this happen? Why aren't you doing something about this? Why? You'll often hear people respond to that kind of a question and say things like, well, it's a mystery. God's ways are not our ways. Our job is just to trust, or, it's all part of God's plan. All really well-meaning, I'm sure. But if I'm really honest, those come off as very unsatisfying to me and almost anemic. If you've ever sat with a mom after she's just lost her child, saying it's a mystery, that's not helpful. So why? Why doesn't God do something about suffering and evil? Why is Judah destroyed? Why is there so much stinking pain in our world? So one of the ways people work through this haunting question is with explanations of free will. God is all powerful. The theological term is omnipotent. God is omnipotent, or God is all powerful, but has given all of us free will, and it's our choice then how we live, how we treat others, what we do with our lives. So although God could stop evil, God doesn't, because God has given us free will, and with that comes the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful consequences. I struggle with that. Not the free will part. I'm all in on the free will part. I'm all for free will. But I struggle with the idea that God is all powerful. The idea that God would have the power to stop a child from being sex trafficked. Or God could single-handedly stop a global pandemic. Or God could have saved those women in Atlanta, but didn't. Because God didn't want to override the free will of a white male terrorist or anti-maskers or a child predator. So I'm a dad of 3 kids, 2 of whom are boys. And my boys play hockey. My boys love hockey. Say they came to me one day and said, Dad, there's some ice on Grenadier Pond in High Park. Can we go out and play some pond hockey? And if my answer was like, absolutely not. Don't go out there. I don't think it's safe. I absolutely forbid you from going out on that ice. But because they're my kids, I look away for a minute and they decide to venture out onto the middle of the ice because they are going to do what they're going to do. Now, say they're out in the deep part of the pond and the ice breaks and it goes bad. What does a good parent do? Do I say, well, I was really clear. I was explicit. I told them not to go, and they disobeyed. It was their choice, and now they have to live with the consequences. That's free will. No, that would be a terrible dad move, right? I would be a horrible parent. I'd be a horrible person if that was my thought process. If that's how I approached the situation, I would be the worst parent ever. And you definitely wouldn't want me as your minister. I would be a jerk. What any good parent would do, because you love your kids, is you do everything in your power to save them from their terrible choice. You call for help. You throw them a jacket to pull them out. You literally do everything and anything in your might, in your power, to get them out of that situation. You use your power to stop the suffering. Even an average parent knows that much. If God does have the power to stop the Holocaust or the Atlanta spa shootings or a child from being abused, but just didn't, I mean, honestly, how good is God? See, if God is all powerful and could stop suffering but chooses not to, it's hard with integrity to say that God is also good and loving. So if we want to say that God is good and loving, which I want to do, I'm all in on God being good and loving, then maybe we need to reimagine our ideas around God being all powerful. Lamentations, see, like so many unresolved whys, right? But stick with me because we're doing some good work here. Let's keep going. Let's push a little deeper. When we think about power, we tend to think about power as having the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want, right? So to be all powerful or to be God would be to always get your way, to always be in control. Your will is always done. But if God's will is always done, if God is always in control, then God wills a lot of suffering and heartache in this world. And I would argue that we would have a moral obligation to reject that God who wills for the abuse of a child or the murder of 8 women. But what if God's power, what if divine power, isn't actually about control at all? What if we've started with a warped idea about what power is and then projected that onto God? Now, the Apostle Paul talks about this in the New Testament. There's this little verse that's buried away at the start of 1 Corinthians, and it's easy to miss, but it's like profoundly transformative. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, the Apostle Paul says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness." So we're talking about the cross here. We're talking about what the cross is about. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The Greek word there is dynamos, from which we get dynamite. It's like the pop, it's the power, it's the explosion, it's the most powerful thing of God. What does God's power look like? God's power doesn't look like control. God's power looks like the cross. What do we see in the cross? The cross is the ultimate divine expression of self-giving, self-sacrificing love. The cross is where God says, I love you so much that I will die for you, but I will never kill for you. It's where God says, forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they do. The cross is about God choosing love over violent power, religious power, political power, coercive power. The cross says God's power looks like self-sacrificing love. The greatest power in the universe is never control, it's love. And this makes sense when you understand the essence of God is only ever love. 1 John chapter 4, right? There's this one sentence, beautiful. God is love, period. The very essence of God is love. God cannot be reduced to anything less than love. Are you with me, Humber Valley? I know there's a lot. I'm hitting you with a lot of theology today, but stick with me. Remember, we can always go back and watch this again. Keep coming because we're getting somewhere good. So, if God's power is love, and if God's essence is love, the thing about love is true love, pure love, never controls or coerces that which they love. If you love someone, you want them to be them. You want them to make their decisions. You don't want to reduce them to something you can't control. You want them to flourish as themselves. If you're trying to control them, it's not them you love, but what you want to make them that you're in love with, right? In love, there is no control. In love, there is no coercion. In love, there is no manipulation. Thomas Ord has a great analogy on this one. He says, God can't stop evil, just like a mermaid can't run a marathon. Think about that. God can't stop evil, just like a mermaid can't run a marathon. By the very nature of a mermaid being a mermaid, she can't run a marathon. Not that she doesn't want to or she chooses not to. No, she can't. You can't run a marathon if you have a fishtail rather than legs. If she could run a marathon, she wouldn't be a mermaid. Marathon running mermaids can exist. Okay, that's the most absurd thing I've ever preached, but it's still true. Likewise, if God is pure, true, good love, just like a mermaid can't run, God can't force or manipulate or control or coerce to achieve God's will. Because God is love. And pure love can't do anything that isn't love. In order to be a mermaid, one can't have legs. In order to love, God cannot control or override people. We can't say that God is both good and has the power to stop all suffering. If we want to say that God is all-powerful, we have to reimagine power. And as Paul says, we reimagine it in light of the cross. God's power is God's love. And love never coerces the other. It lays down its life for the other. Do you see that? Are you with me? So if God, being God, can't solve the problem of evil and suffering, where's the hope? If love can't control, what can love do? Well, love can call. And love can invite. And love can lead. And love can inspire. Love can cooperate, and love can partner. What if for God it has never been about the power to impose some divine template that will fix it all? Because love can't do it single-handedly. But what if it's the gentle whisper of the divine calling to all creation, inviting all humanity, leading our imaginations to cooperate and to partner with God in the creation of what the Bible calls a new heaven and a new earth, a new humanity, where there is no more pain and no more sorrow, no more tears, but where there's justice and peace? What if love is a partnership with the divine when we don't ask an outside force to stop racism and violence and apathy and indifference and greed, but where we follow and partner with Christ, becoming that force together? Wouldn't that be a Holy Spirit? As love, God cannot single-handedly control the outcomes, but has always been leading us, speaking to us, calling us to partner with the divine Spirit for a world that is about flourishing and the well-being of all creation. Friends, there is no resolution in Lamentations because we still have work to do. As long as there are cries of disappointment and loss, the story isn't done. Why? Why does God not stop the suffering and the evil? Because maybe God can't. Maybe God can't do it alone. Maybe love needs you and I to trust that stirring in our spirit, to listen to that call in our bones, and to follow the spirit of love. Which strangely leads to one more inevitable question. It's the question of how. How do we do it? How do we make an impact? How? And friends, welcome to Lamentations, the book of how.